The first sign wasn't a press conference. It was a price chart. Oil sliding. Not because the world ran out of demand, but because someone in Washington had just hinted they could add supply with a pen. Early January 2026, the U.S. president posts a message that sounds almost casual. Venezuela will turn over 30 to 50 million barrels of oil that's been effectively trapped under sanctions, and the U.S. will sell it at market prices. The market hears one word: more. Prices dip. Traders do the math. A few dozen million barrels isn't infinite, but it's enough to nudge sentiment in a market already worried about oversupply. But here's the twist. The real switch wasn't the oil. It was the money. Because the deal isn't framed as Venezuela sells oil again. It's framed as the U.S. takes custody of sanctioned barrels, sells them, and controls the revenue. A financial leash disguised as an economic lifeline. Oil can move, but the cash doesn't move freely. And while that's happening, the ocean becomes a courtroom. Since mid-December, Venezuelan exports have been squeezed by a U.S. maritime crackdown. Tankers chased, boarded, even seized. Ships that used to drift toward Asia now hesitate, go dark, turn around. In the middle of that pressure, one channel stays open. Chevron, still moving Venezuelan crude under a U.S. license, roughly 100,000 to 150,000 barrels a day. Now picture Beijing watching this. Venezuela's barrels have long been a discounted stream into China. Suddenly the U.S. isn't just influencing the flow, it's sitting on the valve. And when one country controls the valve, everyone else ends up negotiating in the shadow of the hand that can turn it off. To understand why that January headline hit like a switch, you have to rewind to the moment Venezuela's oil stopped behaving like oil. For decades, Venezuelan crude wasn't just a product. It was a bloodstream, feeding government salaries, importing food, keeping the lights on. But starting in the late 2010s, Washington didn't try to bomb the oil. It did something cleaner, colder, and often more effective. It sanctioned the system around the oil. Here's what that means in plain English. A barrel doesn't travel by itself. It needs a buyer, a bank, an insurer, a ship owner, a port, paperwork, and credibility. Cut any one of those links, and the barrel becomes a paperweight. When the U.S. sanctioned Venezuela's state oil company and tightened enforcement, the market didn't just lose Venezuelan supply. It lost the ability to touch it without getting burned. Traders stepped back. Banks froze. Insurance got nervous. Tankers started avoiding the risk. And something else happened, quietly but brutally. Venezuela's oil fields were already battered by years of mismanagement and underinvestment. Once cash and spare parts got harder to move, decline turned into collapse. Pumps rusted. Pipelines leaked. Skilled workers left. Production didn't fall like a normal commodity cycle. It fell like a building with its support beams removed. So where did the oil go when the West backed away? East, toward buyers who could tolerate the heat. China, in particular, became the awkward answer to a simple question. If you can't sell oil normally, you sell it quietly at a discount through complicated routes, sometimes as repayment, sometimes as leverage. That's the lock the U.S. built. Not a wall around Venezuela's wells, but a chokehold around everything the oil needs to become money. And here's the cliffhanger. If the lock was that strong, why did any oil still move at all? And why did Washington keep one thin channel open on purpose? In the sanctions world, permission doesn't come as a handshake. It comes as a document, dry language that acts like a key. And for Venezuela, the U.S. didn't leave the door fully locked. It left one thin side door cracked open on purpose. While most of the oil economy was treated like a contaminated zone, banks backing away, insurers refusing coverage, shippers raising their hands, Washington carved out narrow authorizations for limited activity. Not freedom, not normal trade, a controlled exception. That exception mattered because oil isn't just what comes out of the ground. Oil is a chain. Contracts, tankers, ports, payments, spare parts, diluent, engineers. Break the chain, and production doesn't just fall, it corrodes. So, the U.S. played a double game. On one side, it tightened pressure on the main pipeline of revenue. On the other, it kept one U.S. company's joint ventures alive enough to keep barrels moving, often on the order of 100,000 to 150,000 barrels a day, and kept a small channel flowing toward the U.S. Gulf Coast. Why keep any channel at all? Because a total shutdown sounds tough, until you price the consequences. A failed oil state doesn't politely collapse. It spills migration, instability, black market trade, and a deeper embrace of America's rivals. A narrow license is leverage you can dial up or down. It's also a way to keep a U.S. footprint on the ground, eyes, relationships, technical knowledge, while everyone else is pushed into the shadows. And that's the real point. The spare key wasn't mercy. It was control by design. Now here's where it gets dangerous. Once you realize Washington can open a side door, you start asking the next question. What happens when the U.S. decides to open the main gate? Just long enough to change everyone's behavior. The strange thing about sanctions is that they don't just punish. They teach people how to survive without you. And by 2023, Washington realized something uncomfortable. If you squeeze forever, you don't get obedience. You get new supply chains, new middlemen, new loyalties. So, in October 2023, the U.S. tried a different weapon. Not a hammer, a lever. A temporary easing that told the world Venezuela's oil can come back if Caracas plays ball. Behind the scenes, the bargain was framed around politics, an electoral roadmap, promises about competition, candidates, prisoners. But on the ground, the impact was pure economics. Traders who'd been hiding in the shadows stepped into daylight. Tankers got booked. Contracts got dusted off. Everyone moved like they'd heard the same rumor. The window is open. Take your shot. Here's the part most people miss. Even a temporary opening changes behavior fast. Once the market smells legal oxygen, it starts rebuilding pipelines you can't see, payment routes, insurance comfort, shipping confidence, and then the real power move comes next. You remind everyone that oxygen is rented, not owned. By April 2024, Washington pulled the lever back. The broader authorization was allowed to expire and replaced with a wind down. Basically a countdown clock that says, finish what you started, close your books, and stop pretending this is normal. It's like letting someone run through a doorway and then shutting it mid-stride. That whiplash did two things. It punished Caracas, but it also warned every buyer, especially in Asia, that Venezuelan oil isn't just a commodity. It's a policy instrument. And if oil is a policy instrument, then the question isn't, how many barrels are there? Like, the question is, who gets to decide when the window opens? And who gets trapped when it slams shut? April 2024 is where the lesson got written in ink. This wasn't a comeback story. It was a controlled experiment. And the lab could shut the lights off any time. When Washington pulled back the broader oil relief, it didn't slam the door in one violent motion. It did something more surgical. It started a wind-down clock. Roughly 45 days for companies to wrap up what was already in motion, then stop. No new growth. No fresh contracts. No, let's scale this up. Just close your positions and walk away. In plain terms, wind down is what you do after the party when the cops are outside. You're allowed to leave. You're allowed to pay the tab. But you're not allowed to order another round. And that changes everything. Because oil deals are built on planning. Tankers booked weeks ahead, blending arranged, insurance underwritten, money routed through banks that hate surprises. The moment that countdown starts, every participant has to ask the same brutal question. What happens if my ship is at sea when the permission expires? That fear becomes a tax. Not a tax paid to a government, paid to reality. Discounts widen. Middlemen demand more. Everyone prices in the risk that the rules change mid-voyage. For Venezuela, it meant the same old nightmare. Cash tightens, maintenance gets delayed, production struggles to stabilize. For buyers, it was a warning label. Venezuelan crude isn't just heavy and sour, it's politically volatile. And for Washington, it proved the point. If you control the license, you control the tempo. Now comes the next move, because in 2026, the U.S. doesn't just control the tempo. It reaches for the cash box itself. If you want to understand the real power move, don't picture an oil rig. Picture a bank vault. Because in 2026, the United States didn't turn Venezuela's oil back on by fixing pumps or drilling new wells. It did it the American way, by deciding who can legally touch the money. The White House message was blunt. Venezuela would hand over 30 to 50 million barrels that had been stuck under sanctions. The U.S. would sell them at market prices, and the revenue would run through U.S.-controlled accounts. Not Caracas's hands. Not a free-for-all. A supervised pipeline where the cash can be paused, redirected, or released in pieces. That's not just a trade deal, that's custody. Think about what that means in the modern oil world. A barrel is only valuable if it can be insured, shipped, paid for, and settled through banks that trust the transaction. The U.S. doesn't need to own Venezuela's oil fields to shape Venezuela's future. It just needs to control the financial oxygen those oil fields depend on. And when U.S. officials talk about doing this indefinitely, they're describing something even bigger. The U.S. doesn't just want the barrels. It wants the role of market maker, the hand that decides where Venezuelan crude goes and under what conditions. For Americans, this lands close to home. U.S. Gulf Coast refineries are built to digest heavy crude, and Venezuela is right there. Geography alone makes it a natural fit. For China, it's a nightmare wrapped in a headline. Because if most Venezuelan barrels were flowing toward Asia before, this new setup puts Beijing in an awkward spot. It's not just competing for supply, it's competing against a system where Washington controls the switchboard. And when the switchboard is American, the next question becomes unavoidable. If China wants those barrels back, what price does it have to pay, and to whom? In a refinery town in China's Shandong province, the people who feel this first aren't diplomats. They're buyers, independent teapot refiners staring at spreadsheets, watching their favorite crude grade like it's a heartbeat monitor. For China as a whole, Venezuelan oil is only a slice, roughly 4% of seaborne imports. But for these refiners, it's the difference between running full and running scared. In 2025, China averaged roughly around 400,000 barrels a day of Venezuelan crude. Then, as the crackdown tightened, something predictable happened. Everyone rushed the door before it closed. By December, arrivals of Venezuela's extra-heavy Marais were tracking above 600,000 barrels a day, the kind of surge you only see when traders smell trouble coming. Now the door is closed. Loadings bound for Asia stall. The ships that already left keep drifting toward China, and there's still oil sitting on the water. Enough, by some estimates, to cover about 75 days of Chinese demand. That inventory buys time, but it also creates a countdown, because the awkward spot for Beijing isn't, will we have oil next week? It's, who controls the rules next month? If Venezuelan barrels get rerouted to U.S. ports, China loses a stream of cheap, heavy crude that was often bought at deep discounts. You can see the stress in the pricing. Sellers were talking discounts of about $15 per barrel versus Brent, then about $10 as the market froze and everyone tried to reprice risk. Some offers rise, but deals stop. Nobody wants to be the company whose tanker becomes tomorrow's headline. So China's refiners do what they say, sure. Feige Krillin heavy disappears, they lean harder on other sanctioned supply, Russia's Iran, because it's available, familiar, and just as politically gray. And that's the irony. China can replace Venezuela's oil. What it can't easily replace is the lesson Venezuela just taught. When Washington wants leverage, it doesn't need to outbid you. It just needs to control the sea lanes, the paperwork, and the switch. If sanctions are the law on paper, the ocean is where that law becomes real. And in early January 2026, the sea didn't look like a trade route. It looked like a checkpoint. Picture the North Atlantic. Cold spray, steel gray water, and a tanker that shouldn't matter to anyone. Except it does. U.S. forces intercept it anyway. Not in a harbor. Not after it docks. Out there. Between weather and distance, where the only things that count are radio calls, boarding ladders, and the authority to stop a moving ship. Reports described a vessel that had slipped past the Venezuela blockade weeks earlier, then tried to change its identity. New flag, new name, same shadow, because that's how the Dark Fleet works. Ships that move sanctioned cargo often survive by becoming hard to track, hard to ensure, hard to prove. But Washington's message was simple. We can still find you. And that's what changed the psychology overnight. When a blockade isn't just a threat, but an operation, when tankers can be boarded, seized, rerouted, oil stops being a deal and becomes a risk. Insurers get nervous. Brokers stop returning calls. Ports ask harder questions. Captains hesitate. Cargoes sit in limbo, floating like money no one wants to touch. The ocean turns into a financial filter. It decides which barrels stay legitimate and which barrels become radioactive. Now zoom out to China. A refinery in Shandong can argue about price all day. It can't negotiate with a Coast Guard cutter in the Atlantic. And that's the awkward spot Beijing is sliding into. It's not losing Venezuelan crude because someone outbid them. It's losing it because the route itself is being policed because the world's most powerful navy just turned shipping lanes into leverage. When the sea becomes the choke point, the real commodity isn't oil anymore. It's permission. Back in the United States, this story doesn't start in Caracas or Beijing. It starts on the Gulf Coast, in places where the air smells like salt, fuel, and hot metal. Refinery towns built around a simple truth. America produces a lot of oil, but not always the kind of oil its biggest refineries were designed to eat. Most U.S. shale is light and sweet, great for some products, but not ideal for every machine. Many Gulf Coast refineries were built like steel stomachs meant for heavy, sour crude. The thick, dirty stuff that needs complex equipment to break it down. Cokers, hydrocrackers, desulfurization units. Feed them the wrong diet, and you don't just lose efficiency. You lose profit. You get different yields, different margins, different headaches. That's why Venezuelan crude always mattered. It's not just more oil, it's a specific feedstock. Heavy grades that slot into existing refinery hardware like a missing gear. And geography makes it even more tempting. Venezuela is close. Shorter voyages, faster turnaround, less shipping risk, at least in theory. So when Washington signals it can release tens of millions of barrels and route them through U.S.-controlled channels, it isn't just playing geopolitics. It's dangling something practical in front of American industry, a way to stabilize heavy crude supply without begging rivals, without rewriting refinery blueprints, without pretending light shale can do every job. But here's the catch. A one-time release is not a resurrection. 30 to 50 million barrels is a surge, a burst of oxygen. The real question is what happens after the first breath. Because if Venezuela can't sustain production, if infrastructure is corroded, if skilled workers are gone, then this switch doesn't turn the system back on. It just lights the room long enough for everyone to see how damaged it really is. Here's the uncomfortable truth about turning the oil back on. A switch can restart flow, but it can't rebuild a system. Venezuela isn't short on crude. It's sitting on one of the largest oil endowments on Earth. What it's short on is everything that turns oil into stability, functioning infrastructure, reliable electricity, spare parts, skilled labor, trust in contracts, and the kind of boring institutional competence that keeps pipelines from leaking and refineries from stalling. This country once pumped over 3 million barrels a day. In the years that followed, production didn't just decline. It fractured, falling to levels that at times were below 1 million. Not because the oil vanished, but because the machine around it broke. That's why the U.S. move matters. Washington didn't promise a Venezuelan miracle. It offered something more surgical. Barrels released under supervision, money routed through controlled channels, leverage disguised as logistics. For the U.S., it's a way to stabilize heavy crude supply without handing Caracas a blank check. For China, it's a reminder that cheap barrels can come with a political price tag. And the price isn't always paid in dollars. Sometimes it's paid in dependency. And for Venezuela, the irony is brutal. The country that lives on oil can be forced to borrow access to its own lifeline. One license, one account, one decision at a time. So the story ends with a question that isn't about Venezuela at all. It's about power in the modern world. If oil is the bloodstream, then whoever controls the valves and the money can shape nations without firing a shot. And once you see that, you start noticing the switches everywhere.